Welcome to the Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Kevin Timpe about grace and free will, and in particular, a puzzle that arises in Christian philosophical theology.
Thanks for listening. Well, I'm happy to introduce Kevin Timpe, William H. Jellema Chair in Christian Philosophy at Calvin University. Kevin is also a disability and inclusion advocate, and a lot of his recent work as a philosopher focuses on issues in the philosophy of disability and its intersection with some other areas of philosophy, including the philosophy of religion. But Kevin's also written several and edited several books on free will, including Free Will, Sourcehood, and Its Alternatives, which was published by Bloomsbury. I have the second edition. It came out in 2013, and it's a great introduction to free will. He's also the author of Free Will in Philosophical Theology, which was also published in 2013, and which explores a lot of the topics that we're covering in this season of the podcast on free will and theology. One of the topics that Kevin explores in that book is the issue of how a fallen will might be realigned, and in particular, how grace and free will might interact. And Kevin's also written some papers on this topic, including one called Grace and Controlling What We Do Not Cause, which was published in Faith and Philosophy in 2007. And then a little bit more recently, Cooperative Grace, Cooperative Agency, which came out in the European Journal for Philosophy of Religion in 2015. And that's the topic that we've invited Kevin to discuss with us on the show today. So welcome to the show, Kevin. Thanks so much for joining us. Could you start by telling us and our audience a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Sure. I'm somebody that discovered philosophy, as many students do, in college. Mm-hmm. When I talk with my students about my own philosophical journey, I often tell them that when I took my first philosophy class, which I took as a general education requirement, I was thrilled to find a class not only that allowed me the opportunity to think about a number of things that I had been thinking about for years, how to make sense of free will, how do we understand God, etc., but actually encouraged me to ask the sorts of questions that sometimes my parents or my youth group leaders had not really been thrilled for me to ask. Right. And so even though I started college as a biology and chemistry double major, when I discovered philosophy, just like, I want to keep doing this. And I've been fortunate at each step to, be able to initially get into a master's program and then get my PhD. And I've stumbled into a number of jobs. I've somehow convinced people to keep hiring me. I've now taught at 3 different universities. And in many ways, the attempt to, over the years, to think about free will is like to think about not only free will itself, but free will as related to theological topics that got me interested in philosophy and that continue to, I think, have sort of a pull on my own life and my own intellectual journey. So for me, it's in many ways the process of convincing somebody else to pay me to think about the kinds of stuff that I like to think about.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, very cool. Well, as Taylor said, our focus today will be on a puzzle that arises for the Christian view of divine grace towards fallen human beings. Could you say a bit about the relevant Christian beliefs that are in the background in this discussion, and perhaps especially about sin and grace, and then describe the puzzle that arises?
Sure. When I think about philosophy of religion, as somebody from the Christian background, somebody who is a Christian, I think it primarily within the constraints of Christian theology. I mean, I'm also interested in sort of medieval Islamic views about virtue formation, but much of what I'm trying to do when I do philosophy of religion, or sometimes what's called analytic theology, is use tools given to us by the analytic philosophical tradition to think about traditional theological, in this case, Christian theological topics. And so the way that I describe it in my book, Free Will and Philosophical Theology, is not necessarily arguing for a set of Christian claims about the nature of sin, the nature of human fallenness, the nature of grace, but taking those Christian claims as sort of the parameters. Can we tell a coherent philosophical story that could be, for all we know, true, and we might actually think is true given the reasons that we have for our theological beliefs? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the way that I approach this set of topics in general. A little bit more specifically, I tend to be conservative in a number, or at least some sense of that term. Conservative is one of these terms that's very controversial these
Sure.
days.
Yeah.
But the fact that something has been taught by the majority of the Christian tradition, if it has near consensus support in the early church, among the patristics, etc., for me, that all carries evidentiary weight, epistemic weight. And so while at times when I think that there are good reasons to, I'm willing to depart from what a majority of the Christian tradition has said on certain topics. This is my own view, for instance, about women's ordination. In general, I would like to see if we can make sense of what the tradition traditionally has said. And so when I started thinking about grace, I spent a lot of time reading, unsurprisingly here, Augustine, whose views have shaped so much of especially Western views of theology. And with respect to grace, many of Augustine's views are contrasted with Pelagius and some of his followers that Augustine was arguing against in part of his career. And so it looks to me like church tradition has endorsed, not in a creedal way, but in a very strong way, drawing on the epistemic weight of tradition, as I've said, what I call in my paper the anti-Pelagian constraint. And so this is just the idea that a fallen, sinful human being can't cause or will any particular good, including the will of that person's coming to saving faith, apart from a unique grace by God. The way that this is often described is that Augustine believed in grace and Pelagius didn't, and I actually think that that's the wrong way to think about it. For Pelagius, he's quite clear that our mere existence is graced, that our continue to exist is grace. But for him, the question is, in addition to that grace that is built into our existence and then our nature as humans, is there some further divine activity, some further divine grace or action that God needs to do? Because given the effect of sin, our wills are misshapen and now unable to will a good thing on their own. But of course, as soon as we say that we're unable to will a good on our own, right, all these questions about free will start to come up.
Yeah,
that's
really helpful. Thanks. You know, in your work on grace and free will, that one way to avoid the problem here is to accept that God determines all human actions. But you'd prefer a solution that's consistent with a libertarian picture of human free will. We'll ask more about the solution that you've proposed in your work in just a minute, but at a very general level, what are some of the types of solutions to the puzzle here that have been proposed?
So, as you mentioned, if one were a theological compatibilist, they think that God's determining our actions is compatible with humans acting freely, and a theological determinist who happens to think that everything is in fact theologically determined, then in one sense, you've got an answer to sort of the problem of grace. God causes us to have these good wills. We're not causing them on our own, but God causes us to do them freely. And so if you think of God's activity in the theological determination of human wills as a kind of unique grace, and I think it's very plausible to do that, then you have God's being in control of that coming to have the switch of the will from rejecting God to accepting God. The human will is involved, but it's God that is doing the relevant causal work, the determining work, by causing us to freely choose our will, right, shift our wills from opposed to accept. Which I think is a nice, clean answer if theological determinism and theological compatibilism are true.
Right.
And so here's a place where I think one set of admittedly controversial theological claims makes one set of theological, philosophical issues easier. But in some of my work, I've argued that theological compatibilism and theological determinism make issues related to the problem of evil, related to the nature of hell, et cetera, trickier.
Yeah.
And so I think that there are good philosophical reasons to resist theological compatibilism and theological determinism. But if one is a theological compatibilist and theological determinist, like that package can help address sort of the puzzle of grace pretty easily. I think that the theological compatibilist and the theological determinist does have the question of providing an answer to, then, are all human wills determined in this sort of way? If I were a theological compatibilist and determinist, I'm pretty sure that I would be a universalist and think that God does do this saving causal work, graced work for all humans, and we all end up being saved. I'm hopeful that that's true. But again, I think that there's a pretty robust tradition, not a uniform tradition, but a pretty robust tradition that rejects that kind of guaranteed universalism.
Yeah.
So that's one reason not to go down that set of routes.
Mm-hmm.
You do have, I think, a lot of libertarians, people that think free will is incompatible with any kind of determinism, including theological determinism, and think that we do, in fact, have free will. You got a lot of philosophical libertarians that I think are just willing to say, right, we form the volition to go from rejecting God to accepting God. And so if you don't share my view about sort of what I called the anti-Pelagian constraint earlier, right, then you don't have to necessarily worry about this. But as somebody who wants to take seriously the authoritative epistemic or the epistemic weight of Christian tradition on this issue, trying to find a middle position between those I've long thought is both really important and actually really tricky to do successfully.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's a helpful way of putting it.
Mm-hmm. So the proposal that you have put forward is partly motivated by a problem you raised for Eleanor Stump's quiescence model. Could you describe what the problem is and how your proposal gets around it?
Sure. Eleanor Stump was my dissertation director and has been very gracious to me over the years, both in terms of forming me as a philosopher and supporting my work where I actively disagree with her. So I think she's a wonderful model of a charitable interlocutor.
Mm-hmm.
So in her paper in the Cambridge Companion to Augustine, she sort of raises this puzzle about Augustine with respect to the relationship between grace and free will. She connects it to some interpretive difficulties of trying to figure out, according to these contemporary categories, what Augustine's view is. There are some scholars that think Augustine was a compatibilist throughout his whole career. There are some folks that think Augustine was a libertarian throughout his whole career. This is Eleanor's interpretive view. Mm-hmm. I think the most sense is actually that Augustine says things that most sound like he's a libertarian early in his career, but by the time he writes City of God to me reads like he's endorsing theological compatibilism and theological determinism. But in her paper to the Cambridge Companion to Augustine, Eleanor is noting that if we take Augustine to be a libertarian, then you have to reconcile how the human will can be involved in the choice to go from resisting God's saving grace to accepting God's saving grace, this sort of unique grace beyond the grace of nature that I've been talking about. Mm-hmm. And she thinks that Augustine's view of the will can't do it. So she argues that for Augustine, your will is either choosing in favor of something that the intellect presents as good, or it's choosing against something that is good, but either because you're choosing some other thing that the intellect presents as good in a different kind of way, or you don't see the good there. And so on Augustine's view, given the effects of original sin, our will is in sort of a default opposed to God state, right? Yeah. We are roughly akin to a car that is misaligned. Our wills our wills are not oriented properly to the highest human good, which is perfect union with God. So the question is, how can we then become rightly united with God? And she says that on Augustine's view, since the will is either opposed or accepting, right? Like Augustine can't make sense of this because to will to accept the offer of God's grace is a good thing. But if our wills are so misshapen that they can't, apart from a unique grace, do any good, like accept God's grace, then it looks like God's grace would have to sort of break into our resistance. But then it looks like it's God that's doing the saving work, not humans. And so questions about free will come into mind. So at the end of this paper, she suggests that Aquinas' view of the will, developed in, roughly 800 years later, has the resources to account for this. So she says that for Aquinas, the will isn't either willing a good or opposed to the good. There's this sort of turned off state, which she calls quiescence. She puts it this way. This is sort of drawing on Aquinas' view to tell the theological story. And then once I tell the story, I'll say what I think is sort of wrong with it. Yeah. So this is Stump. On the theological story I have told, then, God gives this unique grace to anyone who ceases actively refusing it. But these are not people who already assent to God's grace. They don't accept grace or reject grace. Their wills were actively refusing grace, but then cease doing so without moving all the way to accepting grace. Once their wills are quiescent in this way, God acts on their wills in such a way as to move them to the acceptance of grace, which is the will of faith. And there's a sense in which, I really like this picture, right? Because it can say how God's doing the good causal work to go from neutral, quiescent, to accepting without violating the anti-Pelagian constraint. But since it's the human will that goes from resisting to quiescent, it kind of looks like we still have free will in this case. Mm-hmm. But as I started thinking about that and thinking about what would it take to go from actively resisting to being quiescent, I think we have another version of the same pattern, right? So if somebody is trying to give me a good, give me a gift, do something nice for me, and I know that I can't accept that good, but then I sort of form the volition to turn off my will that was already resisting to accept, right? Then the intentional turning off of resistance looks to be a good thing. It's not good all the way, right, to accepting yet, but it still looks like I am doing a good in turning off my resistance that then is going to have this effect through God's giving me the will. So it looks like it sort of backs up the problem of how we go from resisting to accepting to an earlier, how do we go from resisting to turning off the will? Yeah. And on Stump's view, it's not that a previous active will does this, because that would sort of cause this regression problem. On her view, it just sort of happens. We become distracted or we become conflicted. And so what my criticism of Stump's view is that if the move from resistance to quiescence isn't something that the agent does, then it looks like it's just something that happens to us. Mm-hmm. If we think of free will as, among other things, a kind of control over our actions, then it looks like we're not in control of going from resisting to quiescence. And so what I was trying to do in the first Grace paper is to see if there's a way to tell a story in which humans are controlling the move from quiescence, from resistance to quiescence, that doesn't include that being an actually good thing. So I'm trying to provide, as I see it, a little more human control so that on Stump's picture, God's giving of grace can do the transforming work from resisting to acceptance.
Yeah, that makes sense. I don't know if you want to say any more about how exactly that works and whether, the relevant omission, the not resisting grace anymore, is not really a cause, but is a kind of quasi cause. Yeah. Maybe we could talk about that more. I guess another kind of issue I wanted to talk about, though, is whether if you are trying to supplement Eleanor Stump's account so that you can account for more control, does that raise the problem? Well, now there's sort of so much control that it looks like, the human being is morally responsible for the action in question and maybe even praiseworthy for it. It might not be that they're causing some good, but they might still be, praiseworthy for something that maybe they shouldn't be on the traditional Christian picture. So do you think that would be a problem?
In one sense, I hope not. I mean, all this stuff is, I think, really, really complex. And sometimes philosophers like to talk as if one is clearly superior. And especially then as they wade into theological matters like this, I kind of am worried that sometimes philosophers of religion or Christian philosophers, or the intersection of those two categories, are sort of a little too brash in some of their views. And so, maybe it's the case that on my view, right, there's a kind of praise that is problematic. It's not clear to me that it is. So on my view, and again, to get from the resisting to the turning off the grace, I have to endorse Phil Dow's view of quasi-causation, which is causation by omission, but an omission isn't a thing, and so you're not doing a good thing. Mm-hmm. In one sense, you're doing a good thing from going from resisting to turning off the will. Mm-hmm. And so since if on this view, we can have omissions that function as causes, right? You can cause something that brings about an omission. That omission could then, by transitivity, bring about, in cooperation with the giving of divine grace. So there's a way in which, it does admittedly require, on my view, accepting some complicated and controversial and cost-bearing assumptions about the nature of causation. But if we accept this package, then there's a sense in which I form the will I form the volition to turn off my will. That's not a good thing because it is not actively willing the good. In a sense, it's better than continuing to resist. And so I think the way that I would want to put it is this: we're not praiseworthy for coming to faith because it is God's gift of grace that brings us to faith. There is a sense in which we're doing the better of two other options, right? We are resisting, we are ceasing to do a bad thing by turning the will that is actively resisting off. And all things being equal, it is better to cease to do a bad thing than continue to do the bad thing. Right? So there's a sense in which we have made the better of two, morally relevant choices. So in a sense, it is better, morally speaking, to do something neutral than to do something bad, but it's not yet to do something that is yet morally good. Right? So again, I'm trying to walk this middle position. It is admittedly not clear that avoids all the kinds of concerns that Augustine and some other folks in the Christian tradition have had about whether or not this is a bad sense of praiseworthiness that we couldn't have apart from God's doing the causal work. But it seems to me that something like this is the best option for somebody who's committed to libertarianism to try to make sense of the interplay of faith and grace. Sorry, the interplay of free will and grace in the act of coming to faith.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. What are some other potential challenges for this approach to solving the problem?
I think we've already sort of highlighted in passing too, whether or not the first of which is where we ended on there, whether or not that the kind of good that comes from ceasing to do a bad thing to doing a neutral thing does commit you to a kind of praiseworthiness that violates the spirit, if not the technicality, of the anti-Pelagian constraint. And the thing that I've been most sort of frustrated with about that initial paper is that I think it only works if a certain view about the nature of causation that allows omissions to be both effects and causes of other kinds of things, which is a controversial position in the metaphysics of causation. For one, it seems then that there might be many more causes to things than we might think about, right? Because all the things that could have prevented some effects, they're not happening, which is a kind of omission, then becomes part of the causal chain that brings about. And I actually think that that's not necessarily a sort of an overriding defeater to the package view, but it does require us to sort of rethink, what we're talking about when we say the cause of something was.
Yeah.
I think that we're often not picking out the full causal explanation, but sort of what might be most salient. Right? But it does require a certain kind of being very careful about what is doing the most important causal work versus what's doing a necessary but not central piece of that causal work. And if omissions can be causes, then I think that we have those in lots and lots of places.
Yeah.
So I do think that there are at least two, strikes against this view that don't necessarily undermine it, but just show that it comes with some baggage isn't not quite the right word, but some philosophical costs. And it would be nice to have a view that has fewer philosophical costs rather than more philosophical costs.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. For what it's worth, for listeners who are interested in exploring more about omissions, we had a whole episode with John Stegall where we talked the whole episode about omissions. So that might be worth checking out for some people.
Well, Kevin, in some of your other work, like that more recent paper that I mentioned in the introduction, you've talked about how models of divine and human agency might cooperate in the bringing about of particular human actions. You talk there about two different models, the identificationist and the incarnational models. And you say there are reasons for preferring the incarnational model. Could you describe those two models for us and talk about why you prefer one over the other?
Sure. So as I continue to think about that first grace paper, there's a sense in which me going from resisting God's grace to turned off, and then God partners with me in giving the unique grace that will then take me into the act of saving faith, right? Just makes sense to think about this as something that God and I are doing together. If God was doing all the relevant causal work, we're back into theological determinism, maybe theological compatibilism. And there's some really interesting work just in the philosophy of agency literature about how we can have something like group agency, right? Yeah. And so in this paper, I look at two different ways that it might be understood. The first draws on Harry Frankfurt's, I think, really interesting account of the will. Frankfurt has a hierarchical view of the human will in general. So for Frankfurt, we have what he calls first order desires. I desire to talk with the two of you right now. I desire to drink tea. Sometimes those two desires come into conflict. And a first order volition for Frankfurt is when a first order desire becomes the will that we act on. So right now, my desire to answer the question is winning out, so to speak, over the desire to drink more tea. And so because that is the effective desire, I've got a first order volition to answer the question. But Frankfurt says we can also have higher order desires, right? I've been actually thinking these days that maybe I need to start cutting back on my caffeine consumption. I love coffee. I drink a lot of coffee. I've got lots of desires for coffee. But I'm getting to the age now where coffee past 7 or 8 at night does interfere with my sleep. Didn't used to. It's starting to. And so my desire for sleep and my desire for coffee sort of come into conflict. And I still have the desire to have coffee at 7 or 8 at night, but now I find myself wishing that I didn't have that desire. Right. Or when we go through the moral formation process, we might say, I don't have the desire to prioritize eating healthy over eating what tastes good, but I wish that I did. So Frankfurt talks about what he calls second order desires. It's the desire to have a first order desire or the desire not to have a first order desire. And then for him, a second order volition is when a second order desire becomes effective in bringing about that first order desire to be our first order volition. So that's what Frankfurt thinks freedom of the will is. he also then says that when a second order desire becomes a second order volition, we sort of identify with it. So even if there's higher order conflicts, we're like, nope, I'm going to go with this package of desires and not this other package. And he also thinks then sort of in response to some objections that we have to be wholehearted. We don't just identify with that desire. We sort of claim it as our volition, but we just say at any higher level of conflict, I'm going to go with this side rather than, or it's to sort of block just being divided at higher and higher levels. Right. And so what I suggest in an identificationist model is we might have something like that based on Frankfurt's view. So suppose that God desires me to come to saving faith, right? And I don't have the first order desire because of the anti-Pelagian constraint. Suppose that I know that I can't will what God wants, but I wish I was the kind of person that could will what God wanted. So I have a second order desire for God's desire for me to come to saving faith, to actually bring me to saving faith. Suppose that I identify with that desire. I'm like, yeah, that's the one that I want to win out. I'm wholehearted regarding it. And then I subsequently form the second order volition so that God brings about the satisfaction of my first order desire or my second order desire for God to bring me to saving faith, right? So it's a complicated package there.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, yeah.
But it's a way in which I identify with what God wants me to do and to be, rather than continuing to identify with the fallen, sinful human that I am. And I basically say, I can't make myself into that person. God, you go and do the work. And I think that there's a lot to say for that view. I actually think that this, and I'm taking Frankfurt's work and putting it to a use that I don't think that he actually, puts it to. I don't think that Frankfurt has a particular interest in sort of Christian views of conversion.
Yeah.
But if this is the picture, then I've got, I think, two problems with this picture. The first is that the role of wholeheartedness in Frankfurt's view, I don't actually think has to be there in the Christian story of coming to conversion. I've been starting to put together a course for next year on Augustine's Confessions. Right, and there's a famous passage in there where Augustine is wrestling with what he sees as God's call in his life to be a certain way, and he doesn't want to do it, but he kind of does. And he's got, one of the most honest prayers in the history of Christian theology: God, grant me chastity, but just not yet. Right? There's a way in which he's still conflicted. And if I think back on my own life, right, not only taking Augustine's confession, but even there's a sense in which I think that most of us don't know when we come to faith, the whole of what we're getting into. And I don't think that we have to be wholehearted in that. One of my concerns with much of the way that the Christian life is thought about and tried to be lived, both in philosophical circles, but also just sort of in the general public, is that we sometimes talk as if the goal of the Christian life is a certain kind of certainty. And I just don't think certainty can be achieved, right? I think that we're always going to be weighing a robust set of complicated factors. This seems to be the right set of views. This seems to be what I want to do, but I can't be sure about it. So I think that wholeheartedness just isn't needed for the kind of picture of coming to saving faith. But I also worry that depending on how we understand God causing in me, forming in me the volition to that's at the second order, we're right back in the kinds of issues that we were trying to adjudicate in the earlier paper. If forming a good second order volition would violate the anti-Pelagian constraint, then I think that's a model that we should try to resist. And if God can theologically determine me to form a second order volition, then I don't know that we need to do it at the second order. We could just be theological compatibilists and do it at the first order, but then we're back into the set of problems that leads me to, and concerns that lead me to not be a theological compatibilist and theological determinist. So it's maybe one way of doing it, but I think it comes with costs. So then I turn to, and maybe this was a bad move, But I turn to the place where I think we see the divine will and the human will best exampled as fully aligned, and that's in the incarnation. Now, there's a sense in which maybe this is a bad move because, like, trying to understand regular humans by thinking about this one very unique case where somebody is both perfectly human and perfectly divine isn't going to be super helpful. But the Christian tradition has ways of thinking about the incarnation that I think can help us here. So this is what I then call the incarnational model. So in the incarnation, as I understand it, as traditionally propounded, there's one person, but there's one person with two complete and distinct wills, a human will and a divine will. And what is, or at least maybe one of the things that is remarkable about the incarnation, there's lots of things about remarkable about the incarnation, is that we have the perfect alignment of a human will and a divine will. And there are times at which we see that, like, there's some tension between it, right? Like, there's not antagonism, but in the prayer in the garden, Jesus is like, I really don't want to go through with this, like, suffering and death stuff. Not my will, but thine. So there's, again, a kind of conflict, but where the incarnate Christ as a person aligns themselves with the divine will that is part of their hypostatic union, as opposed to aligning with the human will and what the human will might want to avoid in that same sort of turning towards the cross, turning towards Holy Week and suffering. And so maybe there's a way of thinking about the human will and the divine will in these kinds of cases as coming together in the same sort of way. Now, this isn't going to solve the problem if my human will is, and I actively will whatever God wills for me, right? Because then that would look like you're willing a good, but we've got into this position by trying to figure out a way to not be in that position. But say that when I'm considering myself and my sinfulness, I form something like the following. I know that God wants this good for me. God is willing to give me this grace that will turn me towards God in the act of saving faith, in the alignment of my life with God, what God wants to me. I can't will that, but I know that if I cease resisting, then I'm going to be sort of caught up in the currents of grace that will take me the rest of the way there. So it's a kind of conditional willing, right? I would want this sort of thing if I could, but I can't yet. So I'm going to do the one thing that is then going to, right, get me to stop swimming against the current. And then the current of divine grace will sort of take me to the stage of coming to faith in affirmation. And so there's a way in which my will and God's will are cooperating in something parallel to how I think we see Jesus wrestling in his two natures in the incarnation. And it makes sense to me, given the centrality of the incarnation for Christian views about what it means to be human and how to be aligned with God, that we might have something to learn from that very unique singularity that might help us make more sense of the common experience that those sinful humans like us tend to have. So that's the incarnational model that I try to develop in the second half of my cooperative grace paper.
Yeah, very cool.
Thanks. Yeah, that was really interesting. Well, thanks for joining us, Kevin. This has been a great conversation. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
Probably the best place is to go to my website, kevintimpe.com, my first name crammed up against my last name.com. And then there's a tab on there for scholarship, and I have tried to put the majority of my book chapters and my published articles over the year there, roughly from newest down to most recent. And that's probably the easiest place to find a lot of my scholarly work. There's another tab that has some of the videos, some of the other podcasts that I've been at, some interviews, some talks that I've given in various places. Or if anybody wants, the easiest way is feel free to email me, kevin.timpe@calvin.edu. I'm unfortunately, as an academic, on my computer way too much. My email is almost always open in the background. So it might take me a little bit to get back to you, but you're all, listeners, if they've got further questions or comments, are welcome to email me that way as well.
Great.
Yeah, very cool. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you both for having me.
Yeah. In our next episode, we'll focus on divine free will, and our guest will be Tom Ward, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Baylor University.